Hi guys, so this week we're going to be learning how to use shadows and how to make shadows on objects. So for that we need an object first. So let's try and create an object. So create a new layer and then I'm going to take a paintbrush and give it a hardness of 100%, reduce the size a little bit and place it over here. That is my object. Now, this object seems quite two-dimensional because it doesn't have any realism to it. It doesn't have any three-dimensional elements. It doesn't have a lighting source. So let's go ahead and create some shadows to it to make it a little bit more real. So how do we make a shadow? So the simplest way to make a shadow is by creating a new layer, placing it between the background and the object itself, and then taking a bigger brush, slightly bigger, and reducing the hardness to 0%, changing the color to black, and then just painting it over here. So now we've created a very basic shadow, but the shadow doesn't give the sense of realism. It doesn't give the sense of depth. So how do we change that? So we need to flatten this shadow. So we do that by pressing Control T or Command T on a Mac, holding down Shift, and then uh, dropping the handle down a little bit. In some cases, if the shift doesn't allow you to do that, let go of shift. In some cases of Photoshop, it might change that control, but other just try to do it with or without shift. That'll allow you to manipulate uh, the control box or the transformation box. So now let's confirm that, and that gives us a sort of better view or a better sort of scale of the shadow. So I'm going to make it a little bit lighter by reducing the opacity of it. So over here in the right hand side, we're going to reduce the opacity of the layer by selecting the layer first, reduce it to around 60%. Right, that looks good. I'm just going to move them a little bit to the center. So I'm going to press layer 2, hold down control and then press layer 1. That allows me to select both of those layers at the same time. And then uh, press V and then move them to the center. Right. So these guiding lines, this pink guiding line allows us to see whether the object is centered vertically. In this case, we've centered it vertically, but we haven't centered it horizontally. So if you hold down Shift, it allows you to scale vertically in the direction that you were moving your mouse in. So let's keep that. All right. So now it feels a little better, but we still have to give them highlights and shadows to create a sort of depth to the object. The object still looks flat. So I'm going to create a new layer, and then I'm going to clip it like we did in the previous class, uh, and I'm going to clip it to layer one. For to make it easier for us, let's rename the layers. I'm going to rename the object layer as object, the shadow below as shadow, and then layer 3, which we're going to be making for the highlights, we'll name it highlight. All right. So in this highlight, we take the brush again, hold down Alt to select the eyedropper tool, and then click on the object itself. So you see the foreground color change to purple. So in this purple, we're just going to make it a little bit lighter by moving it to the left, not that much. I think that looks good. And press OK. And then by making the brush a little bit bigger than the original object, and also the hardness 0, we're just going to paint outside of the object. And you can see there's a slight change in color over there. That's our highlight. Now, similarly, we're going to create a little bit of a shadow underneath this part over here. So create a new layer, clip it again by holding down Alt and clicking between the two layers, naming it uh, dark for now, and then holding down Alt to repick the same color of the object, and then do the inverse where we select a darker part of the object, darker color, and painting that in again from outside and that gives us a little bit more depth. It creates a sort of, it creates the illusion of depth by changing the colors a little bit. So we can see the difference between the two by just making those invisible. So this is a completely flat object, whereas this gives a sort of depth to it. We can obviously play around with it because we've used them on separate layers. We have control of manipulating the darks and the highlights. But if you want to manipulate the darks or the highlights in a constructive way, in a non-destructive way, we're going to be using layer masks. So click the layer masks, and we can see that the layer mask has been created on the right of the layer. Take a brush and then paint black in over here. So that I think is a little bit more balanced. But again, if you want to make it a little bit more drastic, go in to the layer, select the paint, uh, select the color, take a darker color if you want, and then paint outside of the object. We're not painting inside because we've clipped it, and all the colors that all the colors that we're painting in on the dark layer are going to be applied only to the object layer. So if we unclip this by holding down Alt and clicking in between the layers, we'll be able to see all the colors that we've been using. Let's not do that, and let's just press Alt again, and that is how we paint in a little bit of the shadows and a little bit more realism to the image. So how do we scale this to a photo composite, or how do we use uh, how do we make shadows for more complex objects? For example, people. So we'll go to the next example, and over here we have a beautiful image of Leonardo DiCaprio. Uh, so we have the background layer and Leo, the foreground layer, and like always, we're going to be creating a shadow by creating a new layer, renaming it shadow, and then placing it in between Leo and the background. So now we're going to do the same thing that we did before, and just take a paintbrush by pressing B, making it black, a little bit darker, a little bit lighter than black, and then taking a brush of a hardness of 0%, and then just painting it. This is a very rudimentary way of doing shadows, and this is not the right way of doing shadows because the shadow doesn't look anything like Leo. So I'm rushing it a little bit, but you can obviously play around with it and make it a little bit more finer and give him the arms. And most importantly, look at the direction of the light. In this case, we don't have a very direct source of light. That's why we have very soft shadows, if there are any shadows at all. So we need to make this a little bit softer. Um, but firstly, let's give it a little bit of a better shape. So we'll create a shadow. We'll create a layer mask for the shadow layer, and then paint in with black so that we minimize a few things that we don't want. Give it a little bit more structure. In cases where we do want to highlight that, okay, and then select the the layer itself, and then sort of paint along and try to mimic uh, what we actually want from the shadow. So by pressing down Alt and clicking on the layer, we can see where the layer mask has painted. So in this case, we see that we've painted black over here, which we don't want. We want to replace that with white. So take that, uh, select a brush, take a white brush, and then paint on the layers where we see black. And if you hold down Alt and click on the layer mask again, we can go back to the original image, and then paint a little bit in over here. Paint on the layer rather than um, the layer mask. So I seem to have messed up a little bit over here. What I can do is I can just go back and erase it because I don't want it, and I can start all over again. Same for here. You can start all over by just painting that in with white. Again, we're selecting the brush tool, not the eraser tool. So be careful about that. And right, so let's try that again. So take a brush tool, make it smaller, then paint near his feet, create a basic shape of his body. Doesn't have to be perfect. Let's say that's good enough. Um, One other thing is we need to make it a little bit softer. We're going to do that in a second. But for now, let's say that this shadow works for us. Let's go and make it. If you observe shadows, they're not usually very sharp. Uh, if there's indirect light to it, if there's direct light, the shadows might be will be sharper. But in this case, since we don't have a direct light source, the shadows are going to be much softer. So we're going to create a blurred shadow. We're going to go to filter, go to blur, and then select Gaussian blur, and then see what works for us. Don't go too overboard. I think that this looks better for now, and paint that in. But again, the shadow is too dark for us. We could reduce the opacity of it, but still it looks a little bit uh, too too fake, I would say. So let's keep the opacity to 100%. And this is something that we're going to learn a little bit about. These are called blend tools, blend modes. So blend modes allow us to change some aspects of a layer so that they match or they can sync in better with the layer below them. So in this case, we have darken, multiple, linear burn, dark color, and stuff like that. So again, like in the previous adjustment layers over here, these blend modes are also segregated or separated according to what they do. So normal and dissolve. Normal is the standard, normal is the default, where none of the properties or none of the layers affect each other. Dissolve sort of creates like a pixelated effect. Darken to darken color are for darkening color layers according to the layer below them. Lighten, on the other hand, lightens them, which doesn't work over here uh, because we can't lighten something that's already we can't lighten the layer below if the object on top of it is black. So we have tutorials about blend modes as well on the YouTube channel. So please go take a look at that because it's a little difficult to explain that in the 20 minutes that we have. So we can experiment and see what works for us on these layers for now. I think that soft light does a good job. So I'm going to pick soft light, and if I change it back to normal, we could see the complete difference over here. I think soft light works for us, and maybe you could go ahead and increase the blur a little bit more. Right. So now, if you change that, you can see there's a difference here between the shadows, and that's one way to create a shadow. But in this case, we weren't able to create a perfect shadow because the shape of the shadow was not the same as the object that was casting it. So how do we remedy that? One way to do that is by deleting the shadow layer that we have over here and duplicating the object itself. So if I click on the Leo layer and press Control J, that's going to give me a copy, and I'm going to rename this copy as Leo Shadow. Then move it below the Leo layer and press Control T. Now, if I press Control T, I have two Leos over here, and I need to skew this or change its perspective so that it's laying flat on the ground. So how do I do that? I do that by pressing Control, holding down control and then using this handle to move it to the ground. So in this manner, I'm going to change the perspective a little bit. So one thing that you need to make sure about is that the feet align with each other, because that's going to be the source of the shadow. That's going to be the thing that's touching the ground first. So we need to make sure about that. And let's rotate this a little bit so that they sort of line up over here. So one thing that helps is you can uh, play around with these anchor points or the handles, and they'll allow you to uh, match the shadow accordingly. And then I think that's good enough. So let's change that back again. All right. So now, obviously, the shadows don't have colors to them. So how do we change the color of the Leo layer? Well, one thing we could do is create a new layer, clip it like we did previously, and then paint it in black. That's one way to do it. But let's see what happens. If I select the shadow layer, go to filter, and go to Gaussian blur, I could see that the shadows are more convincing, but the color of the shadow has also changed according to the color of uh, the color that we had previously selected has also changed according to the layer that it's clipped to. So that's a neat trick that you can do. But one thing that I notice is that the shadows from this left leg of Leo's left leg isn't aligning correctly. So that's something that we need to see to also. How do we check that? So if you take a look at shadows, they're more sharper towards the origin, and as they go away from the origin, they sort of become more blurred out. So that's something that you need to study about shadows themselves, and that's something that we can remedy by using the layer masks again. So this layer mask over here, this white panel over here, is a layer mask just for the blur. So we can go ahead over there and press G for gradients, and then create a gradient of that sort. But now you could see that this gradient hasn't worked correctly because it's going the other way around. So let's try that. So okay, even though I'm trying this, it doesn't seem to be working well, because it's the transition is either too sharp or it's too shallow, which is not what I want. So I'm just going to press uh, I'm just going to change it to complete white again by just painting everything in white. Hmm. What's one other way to make this a little better? Well, another thing that we could do is we could use the brush technique that we had learned earlier, and then paint that in just paint in the leg a little bit. So go in, then paint the leg in a little bit. We can obviously hack our way off into it. This won't work because um, the brush that I use is too sharp. It's going to reduce the opacity a little bit. Now, since this layer is also behind Leo's layer, the shadow doesn't appear before it, and which is a really good thing for us. Then decrease the opacity a little bit to match um, the source that we had before. Now we can obviously see that the blur that we've used is not the same. So we can go ahead and go to filter again, and then play around with that so it sort of matches the darkness that we had selected before, and press OK. Now we do have Leo's layer, and it's sort of a little bit more convincing because this shape matches his hands in a better manner, and if you want to see the before and after, you could see that and that. So that's one way to create shadows. If you like we talked about before, you can also use color mode. We can also use blend modes to do a lot of other things. For example, let's say I want to change the color of Leo's tie. So I'm going to create a new layer, clip it to Leo, and then take a paintbrush, change, let's say select a purple, and then paint on top of Leo's tie. Now this doesn't make sense at all. So if I go to the blend modes and change the hue, come back again, zoom out a little bit so you can see better. So is that shows that the hue has changed from red to purple, and you can do that with any color except for like white or black. So you can see we've also affected some of his skin. So let's go back to let's make a layer mask, select black, then paint off a little bit, and then select white, make the selections a little bit better, then paint that in. So yeah, you can obviously play around with the blend modes a little bit more if you want to change other aspects of it, but the hue works a little bit because uh, that's what we want. What that's the only property that we want to change in the color itself. So that's something you can play around with and experiment, and we'll be helping you around with other things that you want. So yeah, that's it.